The gray waters of the Pacific Ocean crashed against the deck of the USS Mercy transport ship. The date was 17 September 1945. The war had officially ended 2 weeks prior, but for Shizuka Hasegawa, nothing had ended. Captured as a hospital assistant during the final battles on Saipan, she was now in the middle of a journey to an unknown destination. With her were 42 other Japanese women, including teachers, secretaries, and other support staff. All had grown up hearing dark tales about what the Americans might do to them. The ship docked at a camp called Camp Evergreen, on the misty shores of Washington state, surrounded by dense cedar and fir forests. The first shock came from the air. On the pier where they disembarked, enormous ravens with black, glossy feathers were pecking at food scraps thrown by the soldiers. These birds were much larger than the elegant crows Shizuka had seen in her small hometown of Sendai. Almost mythological creatures. The young mathematics student Miyuki whispered beside her, "Look, they're like yokai, a sign that we've been brought to a bad place." However, the camp itself was not the hell they had expected. There were barbed wires, yes, but behind the wires lay a settlement with neatly arranged wooden barracks with green roofs, a grassy square, and even a small vegetable garden. The air was filled with the sharp, clean scent of coniferous trees. How could the people the Japanese soldiers called savage American barbarians have built such a place? This was the first crack. The second and deeper shock came at the first evening meal. Heads bowed, they were silently led into the mess tent. On the tables, there was a box made of shiny tin for each of them, with a red cross and the words U.S. Army Ration B Unit written on it. Shizuka opened the box suspiciously. Out came a bunch of weird packaged things. A hard brown biscuit. A small tin of canned meat. It said corned beef on it. A thick, dark chocolate bar, a packet of cigarettes, sugar, coffee powder, and a weird orange-colored powder. It said Tang on it. Miyuki looked at the orange powder. "Is this poison or medicine?" she asked. Shizuka didn't know. However, another woman opening a tinned meat can, Fumiko, let out a sound. The smell was oily, salty, and something Shizuka had forgotten the smell of for years. Plenty of protein. In the final months on Saipan, their diet had consisted mostly of small amounts of rice, dried fish, and edible weeds. A single tin of meat in this box would be valuable enough to be distributed to a Japanese military unit for a week. They ate their meal in small, careful bites, as if conducting a laboratory experiment. The corned beef was melt in the mouth, almost aggressively delicious. The chocolate, melting on the tongue, was a forgotten luxury. Shizuka noticed her body's physiological response as she ate these foods. Increased saliva production, stomach contractions. Her body reacted with astonishment to this bombardment of fat and calories. This was not a meal. It was a biological shock. However, the real paradox emerged in the rubbish. After the meal, they were tasked with collecting the rubbish. Shizuka saw an American soldier throw a half-eaten sandwich into the rubbish bin without a second thought. That sandwich was more valuable than any meal Shizuka had seen the previous year. There, in the middle of the Washington forests, this deliberate waste instantly rendered meaningless the Japanese militarism's rhetoric of a vital struggle for resources. This waste was either unimaginable wealth or a form of psychological torture they had never heard of before. That night, the women discussed the meaning of this first day in their barracks. Most were skeptical. "It's a trap. They'll fatten us up and weaken us," said an elderly teacher. "Or they've mixed something into the food." But within Shizuka, a different feeling was taking root. Everything they had been taught about the enemy, that they were crude, greedy, technologically backward, was crumbling in the face of this orderly camp, this strange abundance of food. She held the tin of corned beef in her hand. The cold, hard metal was tangible proof of a new reality. "Perhaps," Shifuka whispered into the darkness, "we were wrong. Perhaps we lost the war not just because of the weapons, but because we misunderstood the tables too." Outside, crows cawed. Now their voices sounded less like a threat and more like the mysterious guardians of this foreign, bountiful land. The next morning, they were woken before dawn. However, it was not the enemy's shouts that woke them, but a strange and inviting smell coming from deep within the camp, a mixture of oily, salty, floury, and sweet. The smell wafted from the mess tent, mingling with the cedar-scented air. It was the strangest, most appetizing smell Shizuka had ever encountered in her life. When they lined up for breakfast, they saw the source. 2 American cooks were frying thick, crispy slices of bacon on enormous cast-iron griddles. Beside it was a pile of yellowish, bubbly dough, what they called hotcakes, and golden, crispy potato pieces. Additionally, in a transparent jug, there was a thick, orange-colored fruit juice. This was the liquid form of last night's tang powder. The portion placed on Shizuka's plate was more than a Japanese factory worker's weekly fat ration. The bacon fat was a luxury that melted in the mouth. The hotcakes, served with a thick, amber-colored syrup made from maple trees, maple syrup, were sweet and filling. This was not just breakfast. It was a sensory assault. However, Shizuka's attention was drawn to the cook's behavior. The younger one had taken a hotcake off the grill a little too early. Its edge was still pale in color. The senior cook tapped him lightly on the head with a spoon and laughed. "Don't eat 'em raw, Bill. Wait for them to cook." This small, everyday interaction struck Shizuka. The enemy here didn't shout at each other or punish minor mistakes. They even laughed. It was so far removed from the rigid hierarchical discipline of the Japanese army that it was almost unsettling. After the meal, Shizuka and Miyuki were assigned to empty the rubbish bins. This was an opportunity to discover the true nature of the camp. The bins were filled with half-eaten hotcakes, bacon grease, and even an apple, almost as big as a hand, with just one bite taken out of it. Miyuki picked up the apple. The fruit was fresh and bright. In Japan, such an apple would be a treasure saved by a family for special occasions. How can they throw this away?" whispered Miyuki with astonishment and a kind of sacred irreverence. "Perhaps," replied Shizuka thoughtfully, "it's not that valuable to them. Perhaps there are so many apples here that losing one isn't important." This idea, abundance, sparked a revolution in Shizuka's mind. Japan had waged a war on using everything sparingly, every grain of rice, every scrap of cloth, every human life. Here, the logic was the exact opposite, the logic of abundance. And abundance allowed for wastefulness, comfort, and unexpected kindness. In the afternoon, the women were taken to the camp's small infirmary. There they were met by a middle-aged, calm American woman named Nurse Eleanor. Eleanor examined each of them individually, took their blood pressure, asked simple questions. Miyuki had a minor infection that wouldn't heal due to malnutrition. Eleanor produced a small tube of ointment. This is penicillin ointment, a new medicine, very effective. Shizuka took the tube. This was the legendary medicine they had longed for at the hospital in Saipan but had never been able to obtain. And here, a nurse was giving it to an enemy civilian without hesitation. "This is very valuable," Shizuka murmured. Eleanor noticed her astonishment. "Here, medical treatment is not a luxury, it's standard," she said softly but firmly. "The Geneva Convention and humanity." The word humanity hung in the air. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as demonic, inhuman monsters. But this nurse, this doctor, these cooks, they weren't monsters. They were strange, plentiful, sometimes incomprehensible, but they were not monsters. This discovery shook Shizuka more deeply than the physical shock, because if your enemy is not a monster, then what you are preparing to kill in order to fight them is human. And this fundamentally undermined the entire narrative of the Holy War. At dinner, something even more surprising happened. A dark, fizzy drink was brought to the tables, each in a curved green bottle labeled Coca-Cola. At the first sip, Shizuka's throat burned. Her eyes watered. The taste was like a mixture of medicinal syrup and a caustic substance. Many women coughed and sniffed. But after a few sips, the fizzy, sweet stimulation began to be addictive. This was not just a drink, but a liquid, bubbly symbol of the American way of life. That night, Shizuka no longer argued with the skeptical women. Lying in bed, she listened to her body's sensations, the satisfying heaviness of the bacon, the sweetness of the hotcakes, the strange, tingling Coca-Cola left on her tongue. It felt like the body of a guest, not a prisoner. It was a wrong, dangerous spot. But her stomach was more persuasive than her brain. Outside, the crows were cawing again. But now, the sound seemed less like a warning to Shizuka and more like the wild, mocking chorus of this new, abundant world. They too were part of this abundance, and perhaps, before long, she would be too. On the third day, the camp routine began to take shape. Morning pastries and hotcakes, canned meat sandwiches for lunch, and another tinned meal in the evenings. However, this monotony, rather than dispelling their doubts, only deepened them. Such constant abundance could not be a trap. It was a policy. In the afternoon, music began playing over the camp loudspeaker. A jazzy, soft song with female vocals could be heard. "Don't Fence Me In." The lyrics spoke of a longing for open spaces, for boundlessness. Struggling with her English, Shizuka understood the irony. A song about freedom was played in a place surrounded by barbed wire. Was this deliberate mockery or just coincidence? She couldn't make sense of it. Miyuki came over, her eyes bright. "This music, it's strange, but beautiful. It's like a sad kind of joy." "Yes," Shizuka agreed. "Even the American sadness is different, lighter." That day, a few of the women volunteered to work in the small vegetable garden behind the camp. Shizuka joined them. Working with the soil was something to occupy her mind. The garden was managed by an elderly, quiet American man. His name was Joe. He didn't speak Japanese, and they didn't speak his language. However, Joe used his hands to show them how to plant the seeds and water them. At one point, Shizuka accidentally stepped on a seedling. Instinctively, she bent down to apologize, murmuring something in Japanese. Joe shook his head, smiled, and pointing to another seedling, said, "No problem. There's plenty here." The same phrase, "plenty here." This was the most important, most disturbing phrase Shizuka had heard here. In the late afternoon, an unexpected treat arrived. Fresh, cold milk. Each was served in a glass bottle, ice cold. Shizuka took the bottle in her hand. In Japan, milk was a rare luxury for children and the sick. Here, it was an ordinary drink. When she took her first sip, a strange, animalistic, rich flavor spread across her tongue. She wasn't used to it. But with the second sip, her body seemed to remember an old, forgotten need. Miyuki's face showed pure astonishment. This is very different, but good. However, the real shock of the milk came the next morning. At breakfast, next to the milk bottles were small, colorful paper-wrapped packets of cigarettes labeled Lucky Strike. Shizuka didn't smoke, but Fumiko opened a packet and examined the cigarette carefully. "Look," she said. "It has a filter. Our soldiers used to wrap dried leaves in newspaper." This small detail, the cigarette filter, was proof that American industry, even in the midst of war, continued to produce comfort and even unnecessary luxuries. They weren't just war machines. They were consumption machines. This idea prompted Shizuka to view the camp through different eyes. Every detail, electric lighting, hot water, toilet paper, even rubbish bins, was part of a culture of comfort and convenience. Japanese culture was built on endurance and sacrifice. American culture, it seemed, was built on comfort and individual convenience. And this culture manifested itself even on the battlefield, even in prisoner of war camps. This was something deeper than a military defeat. It was a clash of civilizations, and Shizuka came from the losing civilization. That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened to the silence of the camp. From afar came the chatter and laughter of the American sentries. There was no fear, no sense of urgency. It was as if the war had never happened in the depths of this forest. This sense of normality was the strangest thing to Shizuka. In Japan, the war permeated every moment of breathing, sleeping, thinking. Here, the war was something outside, far away. The camp was a protected, abundant wilderness, sheltered from the war. Miyuki stirred in the bed next to her. "Hasegawa-san, are you asleep?" "No. I dreamt about hotcakes last night," Miyuki whispered, a hint of guilt in her voice. "They were delicious. When I woke up, I felt a little sad. Is that right? To long for the enemy's food?" Shizuka paused before answering. "Perhaps we no longer see them as enemies," she said slowly. "Perhaps we just see them as strange people who give us strange food. And perhaps that's more dangerous." Yes, it was more dangerous, because hatred was a simple emotion to remain loyal to. But bewilderment, gratitude, even a secret admiration, these were vague emotions that gnawed at a person's identity. Shizuka felt these emotions sprouting within her, and she was afraid of that. The next day, Nurse Eleanor called Shizuka to the infirmary. Miyuki's infection was healing quickly. Eleanor handed the tube of ointment to Shizuka. "Keep the rest. Keep it clean. Use it occasionally." Shizuka took the tube. "Thank you very much. This is very generous of you." Eleanor looked at her, a sympathetic expression in her eyes. "I know the time you've spent here has been confusing for you. Not what you expected." Shizuka didn't know how to respond. It was true, but admitting it felt like a kind of betrayal. Eleanor continued, "Many things were said about war, but sometimes the greatest battles are won. Not with weapons, but with stomachs and hearts. The food here, it's not just food. It's a message, and I think you're beginning to get that message." Shizuka left the infirmary, a tube of ointment in her hand. Nurse Eleanor's words ringing in her ears. Wars won with stomachs and hearts. This was a doctrine of war Shizuka had never heard before. The Japanese doctrine emphasized the power of the spirit, of sacrifice. The American doctrine, it seemed, emphasized meeting physical and emotional needs. And right now, Shizuka's stomach was full. Her wound was healing. What about her spirit? Her spirit was divided, bewildered by this unexpected kindness. Returning to the barracks, she saw the American flag hoisted on the flagpole in the middle of the camp, fluttering in the wind. The stars on the blue background, the red and white stripes. This flag was no longer just a symbol of an enemy. It was also a symbol of bacon, penicillin ointment, Coca-Cola, and the abundance philosophy. And Shizuka realized, with a sense of dread, that she felt no hatred towards this symbol. Only a deep, complex curiosity. Was this curiosity the first step towards betrayal? Or was it the first step towards seeing the true face of war? Shizuka did not yet know. That she knew one thing. Every day she spent at Camp Evergreen distanced her a little further from everything she had once known for certain. And this distancing was both frightening and, strangely, liberating. By the fourth week, the normality of camp life had turned into a kind of hypnotic routine. Every morning, they woke up to the smell of breakfast. Every afternoon, they worked in the vegetable garden or the laundry. Every evening, they collected Coca-Cola bottles and cigarette packets. But beneath the surface of this routine, a gradual psychological change was taking place. You could see this best in the change in the rubbish bins. In the early days, the bins were almost empty. The Japanese women had saved or secretly eaten every crumb, every bread crust. But now, real rubbish was beginning to accumulate in the bins. Hot cake edges, the excessively greasy parts of bacon, half-eaten sandwiches. Miyuki, looking at this waste one day, said thoughtfully, "At first, this waste felt like an insult to us. Now, it just feels like a nuisance. We've gotten used to it." Getting used to it, Shizuka thought, an alarm bell ringing inside her. Getting used to it was the death of resistance. As a prisoner of war, your greatest duty was to preserve your identity and your hostility. But this camp gave you no reason to preserve your hostility. It gave you food, medicine, even small luxuries. How could you hate? How could a person rebel against the hand that fed them? This internal conflict surfaced during the camp's first event. One Sunday afternoon, the camp commander allowed the women to watch a motion picture in the camp's small entertainment hall. The film was The Wizard of Oz, a colorful, musical, fantastical American film. Shizuka and the others watched this foreign fairy tale without Japanese subtitles. However, when the scene came where Judy Garland sang Over the Rainbow, Shizuka was unexpectedly moved. The song's longing, hope, desire to belong somewhere else. These feelings were universal. Tears streamed down Miyuki's cheeks. When the film ended, many of the women's eyes were moist. The enemy's art had made them cry. This was a more powerful attack than any propaganda pamphlet. That night, Fumiko rebelled. In the barracks, she stood up in front of the other women. "I saw us crying today for the enemy's stupid songs. That's exactly what they want. They want to soften us, weaken us, Americanize us." She raised her voice. "Remember, they are still the enemy. These meals, these medicines, these films, they are all a trap. They are preparing us to betray our own people, our emperor." Silence fell. Fumiko's words had touched the guilt they all harbored in some dark corner of their hearts. Shizuka felt an urge to stand up. But what would she say? Fumiko was partly right. Yet that wasn't what Shizuka felt. She didn't feel hatred. She was just trying to understand. Finally, the old teacher spoke in a calm voice. "Fumiko-san, I understand your anger. But look, I am 53 years old. For the first time in my life, I eat meat every day. For the first time, a nurse gave me medicine for free. For the first time, I cried while watching a film. And crying felt good. Could this be a trap? Perhaps. But if it is a trap, it is the kindest trap I have ever been caught in." There was a moment of astonishment in the room. A kind trap. This phrase summed up the situation perfectly. Fumiko grumbled angrily, but couldn't respond, because the truth was, the camp was treating them well, and fighting kindness was much harder than fighting cruelty. After this incident, an invisible division formed in the camp. Fumiko and a few other women who thought like her became more withdrawn, trying to reject every favor. However, the majority, Shizuka, Miyuki, the old teacher included, began to adapt to the camp. This was not betrayal, but a practical survival strategy. Their minds were still confused, but their bodies and emotions were accepting this new reality. The turning point for Shizuka came in the camp's laundry room. There were huge, noisy electric washing machines and dryers. In Japan, washing clothes was a time-consuming task that wore out your hands. Here, you pressed a button and the machine did everything. One day, as Shizuka watched the sheets spinning in hot water and soap suds through the machine's glass door, a thought occurred to her. This machine was America itself. Yes, America was this huge, noisy, efficient machine. The reason it won the war was not because it was braver or more fanatical, but because it had better machines. And these machines weren't just tanks and planes, but washing machines, tin cans, penicillin production lines. America was winning the war with its industrial production capacity. And this production was abundant enough not only for weapons, but also for civilian and even enemy comfort. When she grasped this truth, the last shred of resistance within Shizuka melted away. This was not a moral victory or an epiphany. It was a mathematical, cold reality. Japan had tried to fight this machine and had lost. Now she was inside this machine, and the machine was washing and drying her, feeding her, healing her. That evening at dinner, Shizuka sipped her Coca-Cola and glanced over at Fumiko's table. Fumiko hadn't touched her Coca-Cola. She hadn't lit her cigarette. Her face bore a sharp expression born of hunger and pride. Shizuka felt sorry for her. Fumiko was clinging to the past. Shizuka, on the other hand, was drifting uncertainly towards the future. Which was braver? Which was more foolish? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. Camp Evergreen had permanently separated her from the pre-war Shizuka Hasegawa. That woman had firm beliefs, a Clio enemy, and a future filled with sacrifice. The present Shizuka, however, possessed a future filled with doubts, sweet memories, and the monotonous rhythm of an American washing machine. And strangely, this new future seemed less frightening than the old one, because at least in this future, there was no hunger. The year had turned to spring, 1946. The snow had melted at Camp Evergreen, giving way to the scent of pine needles and early blooming forest roses. Time had acquired a strange elasticity that made it easy to forget. Days and weeks passed, the end of the war receding into an abstract date. For the women, the real reality was no longer the war, but the camp's own cycle. Shock was beginning to give way to a complex sense of gratitude and belonging. This was something Nurse Eleanor noticed as she made her final check on Miyuki's fully healed infection site. "It's healed very well," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "Penicillin is a wonderful medicine, isn't it?" Miyuki nodded, a simple smile on her face. "Yes, thank you very much." Her Japanese words of thanks were sincere. Eleanor smiled at her gently, as she would any patient. In this small, ordinary interaction, there was something much deeper than hostility, professional respect and human care. But the outside world found a way into this bubble. One morning, the camp administration distributed the first letters from Japan, sent via the Red Cross to the women. The letters were thin, stamped, written months earlier. A wave of excitement swept through the camp. Shizuka opened the letter from her mother with trembling hands. The letter was written with typical Japanese elegance and indirectness, but between the lines, the desperation was clear. "Dearest daughter Shizuka, we are in good health. The bombing in Sendai did not cause serious damage, but finding food is a daily struggle. Our neighbor Tanaka-san's young son passed away last winter from pneumonia. There was no medicine. There is no real coffee or sugar on the market anymore. We use dried leaves for tobacco. Your father works every day to rebuild the city, but there are no materials. We hear you are safe and well treated. Please do not worry. Our emperor has surrendered, but our spirit remains unbroken. We hope yours does too." When Shizuka finished the letter, she fixed her eyes on her breakfast plate. Bacon, eggs, buttered toast, and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. The orange juice glowed like the sun in the glass. In Japan, where a child had died of pneumonia, where people drank dried leaves instead of coffee, here, a prisoner of war drank fresh orange juice every morning. This contradiction felt like physical pain. Miyuki sat down beside her, having read her own letter, her face pale. "My sister wrote, her son is beginning to lose his sight due to malnutrition. They say it's a vitamin deficiency." Shizuka looked at the orange juice in her glass. Vitamin C. This glass could save Miyuki's nephew's sight. Perhaps it could save her neighbor's son. Here, it was a drink. There, it was a life-giving elixir. Fumiko tore up her letter in protest. "Do you see?" she shouted, her eyes flashing with anger. "While we live in luxury here, our families are dying of hunger and disease. What is this if not a trap? To make us feel guilty, to humiliate us." But this time, her voice wasn't as strong as before, because on the other women's faces, there was overwhelming guilt and helplessness rather than anger. The elderly teacher wiped her tears and said softly but wearily, "Fumiko-san, shouting won't help anyone. Our orange juice here can't reach the child in Sendai." Shizuka had reached the peak of her inner conflict. On one side was her natural loyalty to her family and nation. On the other was the tangible physical comfort this camp offered her, the food, medicine, and security her body needed. Her mind was thinking of Japan, but her body was living at Camp Evergreen. And after the war, the body was more persuasive than the mind. That day, while Shizuka was working in the vegetable garden, Quiet Joe came over to her. Joe had noticed her gloomy mood. He took a small, red-wrapped sweet out of his pocket, a Hershey's Kiss, and offered it to Shizuka. There were no words, just a small, quiet gesture of kindness. Shizuka took the sweet. She unwrapped it and popped the little chocolate into her mouth. The sweetness melted on her tongue. It was a meaningless, personal favor. While children in Japan were starving, an enemy soldier was giving her chocolate. Morally, it was unbearable. But the taste of the chocolate was real. That night in the barracks, the women no longer discussed the future. The future, a return to Japan, seemed uncertain and frightening. Instead, they spoke of the small rituals of the present, the consistency of the hotcakes, the first sprouts in the garden, Nurse Eleanor's calm voice. The camp was no longer a prison, but a refuge. And leaving a refuge was more frightening than gaining freedom. Shizuka reread her mother's letter. We hope you will be like that too, that her spirit would stand tall. But what state was her spirit in? It was no longer standing tall. It had bent, changed shape. It was stretched between the reality on one side of the Pacific and the reality on the other. And with each passing day, she felt the reality here, the reality of orange juice and chocolate weighing heavier. Was this betrayal? Or was it seeing the true face of war after the veil of propaganda had been lifted? Perhaps it was both. Shizuka was no longer sure. All she knew was that when morning came, the smell of bacon and eggs would call to her. And she would answer that call. Because her body was no longer under her control, and her body was not hungry. A few days later, the camp commander made an announcement. The repatriation process was beginning. The first groups would be sent to Japan within a month. Contrary to expectations, the news did not bring joy, but a wave of deep anxiety. Miyuki hugged Shizuka. I don't want to go, she whispered. What awaits me in Japan? Hunger? Destruction? Here, at least I'm safe. Shizuka tried to comfort her, but her own heart was filled with the same fear. Camp Evergreen had unexpectedly become home, and now they were sending her back to her real home, a country reduced to ruins. This was not liberation, but a second captivity. And Shizuka began to think, horribly, that American captivity might be preferable to Japanese freedom. Winter once again shrouded Camp Evergreen in a blanket of silence. Yet beneath this silence lay an intense anticipation brought on by the news of their return. It was now certain they would be leaving. They would return to Japan in the spring. The news seemed to lay bare everything strange and foreign about the camp, with a calm, final sharpness. Shizuka now looked at everything with a sense of farewell. The greasy smell of bacon, the distinctive plop of a Coca-Cola bottle, Nurse Eleanor's calm gaze. All of it was now part of a life she had to leave behind. It felt not like liberation, but like a second separation. Miyuki had grown increasingly quiet. One day, she approached Shizuka, holding the small cloth bag Hana had given her, containing a few honey loops. Would you like to have this? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't think I can carry it. Looking at it in Japan hurts too much. Shizuka took the pouch. This simple object contained all the conflict they had experienced, all the guilt and gratitude. She put it in her pocket. I'll keep it, she said. Maybe one day it will be good to remember. Fumiko, meanwhile, had completely withdrawn into herself. She saw the return as a final victory. At last, she would escape American corruption and return to the real world, no matter how difficult it might be. Yet the look in her eyes was less one of triumph than of deep exhaustion. Like that of a soldier emerging from a long war, preparations for the return began. The women were told to gather their personal belongings. Shizuka's bag contained almost nothing: clothes, her mother's letter, and now the pouch Miyuki had given her. But the real weight of the bag came from the things she couldn't carry. The taste of the hotcakes every morning, the clean smell of the infirmary, the memory of that little Hershey's Kiss chocolate Joe had given her in the garden. These were her new, invisible burdens that would travel with her to Japan. The Last Supper was the same as always: tinned meat, vegetables, bread. But that evening, Cook Bill went around the tables and approached everyone with a small paper packet in his hand. Inside the packet were Lucky Strike cigarettes and a few pieces of chewing gum. "For the journey," he said simply. "Good luck." This small gesture was one of the things that touched Shizuka the most. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't politics. It was just one person saying to another, "Have a safe journey." Was this how hostility ended? Or was this how one understood that hostility had never existed? The next morning, the lorries arrived. The women boarded silently. Shizuka looked out of the window one last time at Camp Evergreen. The wooden barracks, the smoke rising from the mess hall chimney, the large black ravens perched on the wires, watching them. When they first arrived, they had thought these birds were a bad omen. Now, however, they seemed to be bidding them farewell. The journey took longer than the arrival. Trains, ships, finally Yokohama Harbor. When they set foot in Japan, the scene they saw was far worse, far more real than the images they had carried in their minds. Ruins. The cities were piles of rubble. People wandered around, eyes sunken, faces grim, in patched clothes. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and misery. This was a world away from America's clean, forest-filled air. When Shizuka's family found her, they were mutually shocked. They had expected their daughter to return weak, sick, perhaps traumatized. Instead, she stood healthy, well-fed, wearing clean clothes made of foreign fabric. Her mother touched the fullness of her cheeks. "Shizuka, you look well," she said, her voice tinged with surprise and perhaps an unspoken judgment. That evening, when they returned home, their first meal was a diluted vegetable soup and a small piece of dried fish. Shizuka looked at her spoon. It contained a few pieces of floating vegetables and clear water. Swallowing it was a physical struggle. Her stomach was accustomed to the weight of bacon and eggs. This liquid did not satisfy her. It only gave her a temporary illusion. The first night, she could not sleep in her old room. The walls were too close. The air was too still. The smell was different. Here, there was no Joe saying, "There's plenty." Here, everything was a feeling of nothing. No food, no medicine, no hope. And worst of all, there was no understanding. His family could never understand what he was going through. If he told them about Coca-Cola or penicillin ointment, it would seem like a fairy tale, or perhaps even proof of betrayal. A few weeks later, Miyuki came to visit him. She was even paler and weaker. "Do you see?" she said in a bitter voice. "Fumiko was right. Everything here was an illusion. This is the real world." Miyuki still had that little cloth bag in her hand. "Can I have this back?" she asked. "I need it now, at least to remember the taste." Shizuka handed her the pouch. Miyuki took out a honey loop, examined it carefully, and then popped it into her mouth. Her eyes were closed. "Still the same taste," she whispered, "but now it's more bitter." Shizuka began to understand the division within herself. She was now two people: Japanese Shizuka, the woman living among the ruins, trying to care for her family, and Camp Shizuka, the woman who couldn't forget the taste of hotcakes, the smell of clean sheets, the unexpected moments of kindness. These two people were constantly at odds with each other, living in the same body. One day, she saw an old newspaper clipping on the street. It contained a story about a Japanese-American woman nicknamed Tokyo Rose, who had been declared a traitor and convicted on the basis of false testimony. As Shizuka read the story, her heart sank. Here in Japan, even people connected to America were viewed with suspicion. She couldn't tell anyone about the Camp Shizuka inside her. This made her a spiritual refugee, completely excluded from society. As time passed, physical reality prevailed. Hunger, exhaustion, Japan's brutal reconstruction process. These were concrete. Camp Evergreen, on the other hand, gradually faded into an almost dreamlike memory. However, this memory had changed her inner voice. She no longer held absolute beliefs. She no longer divided the world into sharp lines of us and them. She now knew how a glass of orange juice could create a mole earthquake. Years later, Shizuka, now married with 2 children, saw an unfamiliar product on the shelves at a supermarket: Honey Loops. On the box was a picture of a smiling blonde-haired child. Her hand trembling, she picked up a box. She went home and opened it. The smell was the same sweet, artificial honey scent. She took a handful. She popped it into her mouth. Crunch. The same sound. Taste. The same taste. At that moment, Camp Evergreen came to her mind. The bewilderment of the first day, Miyuki's smile, Nurse Eleanor's tube of ointment, Joe's chocolate, the chewing gum Bill gave her when she left. It was all hidden inside this small round honeyed cereal. Her daughter came over, looking curiously at the box. "Mom, what's this? It smells really strange." Shizuka held out a handful to her daughter. "Try it," she said. "This is a taste from far away. A taste that once taught me so much." Her daughter took one, chewed it. A strange expression appeared on her face. "It's not bad," she said, "but it's a bit artificial." Shizuka smiled. Yes, it was artificial, but for her, it was a symbol of the world's most real, most complex reality. It was proof that hostility was an illusion, abundance a weapon, and kindness a revolution that could come from the most unexpected place. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Shizuka took the box and removed a few honey loops from it. She laid them out in front of the window, beneath the moonlight. The small golden rings glowed against the night. This was her secret monument to Camp Evergreen, to the absolute faith she had lost there, and to the dangerous, priceless gift of doubt she had gained. Outside, a star streaked across Tokyo's night sky. Shizuka wondered if it had passed over that cedar forest in Washington state. Perhaps the ravens were still there, silent guardians of that strange, abundant land. And perhaps one day, her daughter or son would encounter their own honey loops, their own shocks, in their own lives. Until then, Shizuka would wait silently, keeping the past a secret. And sometimes, very rarely, she would remember the taste of a glass of cold milk, because she knew she would never find that taste again. But having tasted it once had changed her forever.